Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second lecture of NEW302, the full year Jung course. In case you haven't yet read the syllabus or watched the videos, I'm Anderson Todd. You probably know that at this point. And today is the 17th of September. So today we're jumping in on a couple of things. I will, as per my promise, post 2 one-hour lectures, trying to make them a bit more bite-sized. We will see as things go whether or not the format changes a bit. I hope everybody did manage to get access to the videos that I had posted up from last week, just introducing myself and talking through the syllabus a little bit. If you had any trouble accessing that, please just reach out, send me a message on Quarkus or send me an email, and I'll see what happens. But I figure it's YouTube. Pretty much everybody ought to be able to get fairly easy access to it. Okay, so this is the second week of the Jung course, and we have a few things we want to cover. One, I'm going to cover partly in this video, and then I'll bleed into the next bit. Is I want to talk a little bit about Jung as a person. We're not going to do that exhaustively. I mean, this isn't a biography course, and we're not primarily interested in sort of Jung's biographical material, right? However, his personal experiences are relevant to understanding the theoretical material that we're going to cover. For those of you that have already begun doing some of the reading, or have maybe in the past or are currently delving into memories, dreams, reflections, you'll see that a lot of the psychological theories that Jung elaborates over the course of his career begin, in fact, in personal experiences that he has, both as a clinician, right, working with patients, but also that he personally has. And so having some sense of sort of Jung the person, Jung the man, Jung the human, is actually quite useful. When you really get into this stuff, you can, of course, delve, quite deeply. I think I have 7 or 8 biographies of Jung, which tend to vary between being sort of relatively like celebratory or lionizing, right, for people who happen to think that he was an important figure, to people who really, right, have a strong distaste for him. There are the books that treat him in a considerably less than flattering light. And I think it's interesting to note that stuff also in part. Again, we're not going to look at it exhaustively, but we'll talk about some of it, because that really strong split in terms of how people think about Jung is kind of a fascinating part of his legacy, right? On one hand, there are the people who basically say that he's probably the most significant psychodynamic theorist of the 20th century, perhaps in some ways more so than Freud. I'm not so sure about that, although I am a neo-Jungian and not a Freudian. A lot of respect for Freud. I don't agree with everything, but I don't agree with everything anybody says. And actually, we'll get to this too, but I think that there is, in fact, a more important psychodynamic theorist than either Jung or Freud, and that's a bit of a surprise, but we'll touch on that later. So the people who say that he's this highly significant psychodynamic theorist, there are people who say that he's, in some sense, more significant than that, right? There are a lot of people who claim that, in a sense, his significance as something of a philosopher, and as a philosopher of religion, in fact, in part, sort of outstrips his therapeutic psychological contributions. That's maybe arguable. He's also made significant contributions to pop culture, interestingly enough, which we'll sort of get to. And then on the other hand, we have people who think that he's kind of, a would-be cult leader, a bit of an intellectual tyrant, right? A sort of, a bamboozler, somebody who squandered his wife's significant fortune. And not least, certainly among those accusations, that he was in fact a Nazi. We'll address that right away, because that's often a question that comes up immediately. Was Jung a Nazi? So there are people who claim that basically Jung's sort of failure to denounce the Nazi Party when they rose in Germany, and indeed, a certain amount of kind of compliance with Nazi authorities. They're like, look, Jung was a Nazi. They often claim that his breakup with Freud was sort of indicative of certain anti-Semitic tendencies and so on and so forth. However, it came to light yeah, a number of years ago, and in fact, I only relatively recently became aware of this within the last couple of years, that Jung pretty certainly wasn't a Nazi. And the reason primarily that seems to be the case is that Alan Dulles, for those of you who happen to know Dulles International Airport, this is who, in the States, that's who that airport is named after. But Alan Dulles was an OSS operative. So the OSS was the sort of predecessor of the CIA, and indeed in World War II. So they ran sort of international espionage. They were the predecessor of the CIA during World War II in the US. Alan Dulles, in fact, became the first director of the CIA when the OSS became the CIA after the end of the Second World War. Well, interestingly, Alan Dulles, through his sort of personal secretary, recruited Jung to the OSS during World War II. All of this was very clandestine. And indeed, I believe that the files are still sort of under lock and key. A lot of intelligence files tend to stay classified for quite a long time. Yeah, Jung was actually coded as Agent 488 within the OSS records. And Alan Dulles himself is on record as saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, but very nearly, as saying, nobody will ever know the full extent of the contribution that Dr. Jung made to winning the war, which is certainly tantalizing. The general impression is that probably in a large part what he was doing was sort of doing psychological and archetypal analyses of high-ranking military figures and figures within the Nazi party. So basically figures within the Axis side during the war. And some of that we'll see is actually sort of is prefigured a little bit in essays that he made around sort of the Germanic mythological consciousness. Wotan is a famous essay in this respect, where he talks about this sort of rising element within the Germanic consciousness and the potential dangers of that. And many people, himself included, have read that essay as indeed being a kind of critique and prefiguration in some ways, right, of the kind of, runaway mythological thinking that overran Germany and the other Axis powers to a great extent during the Second World War. So the answer is he wasn't a Nazi, he was a spy. So I like to get that out of the way first. However, he was nevertheless a complicated figure, right? He was extremely polarizing and some of the things that make him polarizing within a modern context are pretty damning. If you've ever seen the film, and if you haven't, I recommend it. A Dangerous Method. It's a kind of dramatic version of a book. A Dangerous Method is a film with Keira Knightley and Viggo Mortensen, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, playing Freud, and Michael Fassbender as Jung. And it details a bunch of things. One, how, essentially speaking, both Freud and Jung stole work from their patient/colleagues, Sabine Spielrein, who more recently has received, I think, the much-deserved credit for things like the death drive as a psychodynamic concept. But also, he was sleeping with her, Jung was. And that was something that definitely came under fire. Now, we look at that from a modern context and find that Jung was sleeping with a number of his adolescents, and of course we're aghast and appalled. It's shocking in some ways to consider, but actually, in some ways, I don't think that was ever a particularly good clinical idea. To be frank, it's obviously extremely boundary crossing and potentially damaging, but it was more common than you might imagine. The strong prohibitions against those sorts of things didn't exist in quite the same way. Now, all of that is, of course, utterly, forbidden and encoded in legal codes and so on and so forth. But so that was one of the critiques. He slept with a number of his adolescents. Indeed, it seems as though sort of one of his adolescents who became his mistress, sort of Toni Wolff, acted as almost kind of a second wife and lived with he and his wife, Emma Jung. That has thrown a lot of people. It sort of seems as though Jung was sort of living in a state of early and undeclared kind of polygamy. So that's obviously, right, undertaken a certain amount of critique. Yeah, and there have been other criticisms of his theoretical work, right? That that it doesn't stand up. Now we can address that head on. The ideas, for the most part, are more than a century old. I mean, some of them are more than a century old, some less. But the point is, right? This is 50 years worth of theoretical material from somebody. Nobody's ideas stand up completely over the test of time, right? Isaac Newton was a relatively towering intellect insofar as he gave us, optics and the theory of gravity and calculus and so on and so forth. And yet, of course, we go back and we, look at vast swaths of that production and say, that doesn't match up with sort of our scientific ideas anymore. Likewise, a number of the ideas that Jung had over the period of his work, now, are often looked at and it's like, well, that doesn't stand up empirically and so on and so forth. And I certainly wouldn't dodge where the empirical evidence clashes with Jung's work that's problematic. However, I think it's important very often to look at Jung's work in a slightly different light, which is to say that although his language of explanation was often off base, and some of that being a function of the limits of scientific knowledge, right, of the time period. So for instance, many people would say, well, why weren't his theories more neurologically grounded? And the answer is because we didn't know that much about the brain, quite frankly. In many ways, neuroscience is still in its infancy. And I do some work in this area, and when you look at the findings and the rate that those findings are overturned, right, it can be quite shocking. So Jung didn't base things too much in terms of neurology, in part because it just wasn't a very sound basis to make those sorts of claims in terms of a language of explanation. So his language of explanation is often, questionable. We sort of wonder to what extent the entities that he's positing are real things. However, his work as a language of training, which is to say a phenomenology, right, remains, in my opinion, one of the great sort of touchstones of psychodynamic theory. And as we'll get into more in this second lecture today, and of course, certainly as we go through the course, and as some of you will know from the half course I teach on the subject, NEW302, Hypotheses of the Unconscious, this sort of psychodynamic material now is really making a strong comeback in terms of plausibility based on our more recent models in terms of cognitive science. So he was an incredibly keen observer of human phenomenology. And more to the point, he was, without question, an extremely talented clinician. So as a therapist, he got sort of remarkable breakthrough results quite often. Yeah, so, it's interesting. He leaves a very kind of mixed legacy. In some ways, right, Jung is still kind of persona non grata within the academy, right? The fact is that courses like this one are relatively uncommon, but he has maintained like a burning popular interest, for one thing. Okay, not that necessarily speaks to his academic chops. What's popular and what's, sort of considered current in terms of explanation don't always line up especially well. But he's maintained this really powerful kind of public influence, right? This influence on that kind of public consciousness, the popular consciousness. And in addition, as we'll find, actually, his work has been tremendously influential on sort of conventional psychology in lots of ways, and ways that very often aren't acknowledged. So he has a lot of influence, but that influence very often is sort of, people don't acknowledge it. And there have, in fact, been a number of prominent scholars, for instance, who very clearly have referenced Jung, in their own research and theoretical development, but tended to shy away from him just because he was kind of, persona non grata, right? He was a little bit forbidden, a little bit controversial. So, okay, so Jung as a person. So Jung was born in Switzerland in 1875, the 26th of July, 1875. Again, we're not going to get into this in tremendous detail, but yeah, born 26th of July, 1875. If you happen to link up with the Jungian Society, which is the U of T student group, which has to do with sort of all things Jung, And I do recommend that. They're a great student group and terrific events, but also a wonderful resource for doing this course material. So if you happen to link up with the JS, they very often celebrate July 26th. I suspect maybe they didn't this past year, since it was not possible really to have large get-together, but fingers crossed. After you've done the course next year, I would encourage you to check that out. So yeah, born 26 July 1875, died 6th of June 1961. So, you can see he was sort of well into his years by the time he died. Let's talk a little bit, actually, about the pop culture and the scientific influence, because I think that's sort of interesting before we proceed on with the biographical stuff. So, there are lots of terms that both see kind of common usage, right, and are also still extant in psychology that are Jungian terms and people generally don't recognize. So the first and foremost of those, okay, is the concept of introversion and extroversion. That's a Jungian idea. So the idea that you are an introvert or an extrovert, okay? And my assumption is that even if you've never formally studied this stuff, you're quite familiar with this term, right? Somebody could throw this around, they would say they were an introvert. And what do they mean? Well, they don't particularly care for sort of maybe large gatherings, right? They tend to be a bit shy. They tend to be, sort of focused inside themselves and pursuits inside themselves. And we think of extroverts as being gregarious and outgoing and liking to socialize and so on and so forth. As we'll see, that's something of a shift away from what the term means in a technical sense, but that idea actually originates with Jung. And to see not just sort of its popular impact, okay, but also its impact on psychology, those of you who are familiar with personality psychology will know that sort of the best validated current system of organizing personality psychology, and there are absolute piles of data supporting this model, is the Big Five model, right? Which you can shorthand as ocean. Okay, so there are 5 components in the Big Five, right? And it's ocean, so it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, right? Agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the E, extroversion, is the introvert-extrovert axis of Jung. So you can see that this is still sort of the best validated theory, and yet much of this sort of emerged from in many ways his intuitions, clinical observations certainly, but his intuitions. That's had tremendous staying power. But there are other things that I think have also had a lot of impact and people don't generally trace back to Jung. So the concept of the complex actually originates with Jung, right? So what's a complex? Well, we talk about somebody, oh, that guy's got a God complex, or he has a Peter Pan complex, or right, that's his hero complex or something, right? This is a term we throw around. And what do we mean when we say that in the colloquial? Well, typically we mean something like, there is this kind of overriding organizing principle within the person's psychology that they're often somewhat blind to, right? And that makes them behave in a certain kind of structured type or role, right? So if we say, when we say, oh, somebody's got a God complex, right? Well, obviously they think very highly of themselves, right? And they sort of see themselves as a powerful intervention. We say they have a Peter Pan complex. Well, what do we mean? To have a Peter Pan complex, like Peter Pan is the boy who never grew up, right? And he flies around. We'll talk about Peter Pan more later in the semester because he's an interesting figure. But, Peter Pan is the boy who didn't want to grow up, and now he lives in Never Never Land and he can fly and so on and so forth, right? So to have a Peter Pan complex is to be stuck in this kind of eternal youth, right? When we say that about somebody, we're typically talking about somebody who's older but seems sort of youthful or boyish often, right? Complexes like the Oedipal complex, right, which we primarily associate with Freud, right, where one has in Freudian sort of systematics, one has a particular kind of often sexually tinted but relationship to their parent, right, for a man for his mother typically, right, is kind of, or no, wait a minute, yeah, for his mother but also his father. There's a kind of double. We'll get into that, but the point is, right, this whole notion of the complex really traces back to Jung also. Another one that you'll see with a fair bit of frequency is the concept, and many of you will have come across this totally independently, is the concept of synchronicity. Now, this is not a concept that has a lot of currency sort of psychologically speaking these days, although I think there's some interesting developments in that area that we'll touch on. But rather, it's definitely got a pop culture kind of imprint. So a synchronicity is a sort of meaningful coincidence or string of meaningful coincidences, right? So, you know, you're thinking of something, it's obscure, and you're thinking, you go, you get a book, you know, at random, you flip it open, and there's a passage on exactly what you were thinking about, right? Now, some people obviously extend the concept of the synchronicity fairly far, right? So the classic version of that is, you know, you were just thinking of somebody and then they called. And of course, there are lots of sort of statistical takedowns of that you can use rational machinery to puncture, where you can say, yeah, okay, but how many times did you think of somebody and they didn't call, and so on and so forth. But the point with the synchronicity, right, is this sort of this striking run of symbolic self-similars, right, and a kind of symbolic echo of an idea that seems to turn up in a way that is coincidental and yet sufficiently meaningful that it's like, well, that's got to mean something, like something's going on, and it's not quite like, it's sort of uncanny, right? It's a bit eerie, it's a bit, right? And of course, this is a very widely reported experience. And when we talk about that later in the course, I'll get into some theoretical work I've done around the area and some more sort of current explications, but also Jung's idea. So that notion of synchronicity, that's Jung. He developed that together with Wolfgang Pauli, who was a quite prominent early 20th century quantum physicist. They developed that in common. So you can see that those sort of Jungian ideas actually turn up all over the place. There are, of course, you know, other ones that are very directly Jungian, right? The concept of the shadow, right, and shadow work is an explicitly Jungian concept that you'll see echoed all over the place. Now, the extent to which that pop culture stuff is echoed, right, the extent to which it still appears within the popular consciousness, there's been a boom lately, okay? So Jung always sort of turned up, you know, so if you look at the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, I should have prepped an image for this. Anyway, if you look at the Beatles cover, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, right, and there's like all those figures standing on the cover of this sort of classic album. If you look, you can find Jung tucked in there, right? He's fairly prominent, but there's a picture of Jung on the cover. There is, of course, an entire album by the Police, which were an English kind of new wave reggae punk group. That's not exactly right, but they were a rock group from the 70s through to the 80s, headlined by Sting, right? A really big band at the time. They had an entire album called Synchronicity. So there's long been this kind of pop cultural thread, right, that runs through. And that, of course, has seen a massive surge in the last 5 years. And I would say that surge is more or less due to two forces, okay, propping it up. Sorry, this is a bit of a digression, but situating Jung before we get into his life is useful. So, been a massive surge. Why? Well, one reason, okay, pretty obviously, is Jordan Peterson. I know Jordan, you know, he was, you know, while he was still doing stuff at the university, he was something of a colleague. I worked with him a number of times on different sorts of projects, not least the Mind Matters series of conferences, which some of you may have seen online. He spoke at, John Vervaeke spoke at, etc. So yeah, I know Jordan pretty well, and he and I had, you know, many conversations about Jung, and of course Jordan, since Jordan Peterson's work has become, you know, sort of massive, right, in the last few years, Jordan's, you know, sort of interest in Jung has brought a massive amount of attention to Jung. And it's unclear, actually, the impact that has in terms of the academy, right? Obviously, Jordan remains something of a controversial figure. And so, you know, consequently, Jung was already a controversial figure. It's hard to know, if you multiply two controversial figures together, you know, what that means in terms of its status with the public and its status with sort of the academy. But there's no question that in terms of public visibility, right, Jordan has made Jung far more visible, I think, to a huge swath of people than, you know, than it certainly was like 10 years ago. And the other factor, which hit me like a curveball, but it was fascinating, is the K-pop group, BTS. Many of you will already know this, but for those of you who don't, BTS, you know, is arguably the biggest band in the world. Certainly, they are massively influential in terms of, you know, their Twitter following and so on and so forth, and You know, the BTS army, as their fan base calls itself, is, you know, like an enormous sort of social force. But what's interesting is a couple of years ago, BTS began releasing a set of songs and then concept albums, which were based on a book, a popularization of Jungian psychology by Murray Stein called Map of the Soul. So BTS has released a series of albums, Map of the Soul, and it's like Map of the Soul Shadow, Map of the Soul Persona. They're explicitly referencing Jungian ideas. So between these two things, between sort of the person who is arguably the world's most recognizable sort of pop intellectual in Jordan Peterson, right, and the biggest band in the world, this enormous K-pop group, are both pushing Jung, you know, out in their respective directions. And so probably, really, in some ways, Jung has more sort of mind share, as they say, right? A bigger footprint in terms of the public consciousness than he has for many, many years. Now, I have to admit, this is something of a curveball for me, just because, admittedly, I've been interested in Jung a long time, most of my life. You know, I started reading Jung when I was really young, but it remained something of, frankly, a fringe interest, and indeed an interest where, academically speaking, I had to fight a lot of uphill battles to do work in that area when I wanted to do my own academic writing in the area. It's a little bit akin, to be honest, to the psychedelic Renaissance, right? Which, you know, many of you are familiar that in the last 10 years, right, psychedelics have undergone this huge overhaul in terms of the respectability. I mentioned this a little bit in one of the videos last week. But you know, that huge increase, so I had already done academic work and had interest in that area. So when it suddenly became not just hugely popular, but sort of respectable, right, like something that people looked at again, it was a bit of a curveball. When I started doing work in the area, I got told that would be sort of career threatening or career destroying, right? You didn't talk about that. But now I find myself in the weird and unfamiliar position of being on the winning side of a cultural argument around psychedelics, which is to say that, like, it seems that the public perception is changing in line with what I thought. And I'll be honest, I'm not used to that. Now, as far as Jung is concerned, it's not clear if it's going that way. I'll make some arguments as to why I think, in fact, you know, renewed attention to Jung is warranted and does indeed, you know, sort of fit within the current ethos of things like cognitive science and consciousness theory. And I'll also make some arguments as we go as to why that material, I think, actually has a degree of unique explanatory power, why it's really worth looking at. Yeah, the third thing in this, which I already mentioned, is role-playing games, which again have reached a public penetration and degree of respectability that I just did not see coming. After nearly 40 years of playing them, it's you know, it's bigger than it's ever been. So strange. It's strange to be on the winning side of cultural arguments when you're used to being like a weirdo in the corner, let me tell you. Okay, so Jung. So Jordan Peterson and BTS have pushed the sort of the Jungian ideas into the fore. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of sort of the landscape of those ideas currently. But where do Jung's ideas, you know, sort of himself, right? So as I mentioned, he was born in Switzerland. His father was a minister. You'll read most of this in the book, so we're not going to cover it in huge depth. But his father was a minister, and, you know, he grew up with a very Swiss upbringing, okay? Eventually, he decides that he's going to be a doctor, and he trains as a doctor. And he ends up specializing in psychiatry. So he does his sort of his early like rotation work as a doctor, right? He's posted in a big psychiatric hospital in Zurich called the Bergholzli. That's got an umlaut in it. So I apologize to anybody who speaks umlauted languages fluently, because I'm assuming I'm butchering the pronunciation of it. But it's there that he has a number of sort of significant encounters in terms of his training, but also most importantly, he begins to encounter patients who are experiencing psychosis. So people who are experiencing schizophrenia, right? But also other forms of psychosis, delusion and hallucination, and so on and so forth. And by his account, he begins to perceive certain kinds of sort of mythic patterns, right? That he sees that much of the material that these patients are spontaneously describing, if you just sort of listened to the things that they're describing in their visions and in their sort of belief systems, right, are spontaneously, in some sense, recapturing elements of imagery and mythology and so on and so forth that, by his account, they had no other encounter with. So quite famously, right, he describes a patient who describes an image of the sun. He's looking at the sun and he's saying, like, the sun has a tube, right, like a penis basically hanging out of it. It's very Freudian there, but anyway, right? And of course, for the most part, in this particular psychiatric institute, nobody really paid attention to this stuff, but Jung started to really talk to these people and listen to what they were describing. And what caught his attention about that was that later, by his account, he comes across the same image in a text of Gnostic imagery, so sort of ancient Christian religious imagery. Gnostics, which we'll talk about, are sort of a heretical offshoot of Christianity that turns up a bunch of times. So this exact image occurs, and he's quite puzzled by this. And he's puzzled both in those specific instances, but right, also he's puzzled at what seem to be sort of commonalities turning up in the mythology and the image systems and so on and so forth of different people scattered across the world. Right? There are certain sorts of themes that he sees turning up in the mythological background of individuals and cultures where it doesn't seem as though there's been sort of a direct conscious line of transmission. And that's when he starts to formulate some of his early ideas around what he eventually calls the collective unconscious, okay, which we'll talk about later. However, before he gets especially far in developing this, he does a little bit of publication around these ideas, and then he discovers Sigmund Freud. And this is an absolute bomb. He reads Freud, and suddenly he has this powerful sense that this other theorist, right, has hit on something very similar to what he's hit on, that there are these underlying structures, these psychodynamic structures within the psyche that are determining things unconsciously. He's totally enraptured. So he writes to Freud, right? And they start their correspondence in 1906, quite excitedly, right? And then finally they get a chance to meet in 1907. He goes to visit Freud at his home. It's important to note here, Jung married into money. So his wife, Emma Jung, was, I believe, the second richest woman in Switzerland at the time. And so he marries into a tremendous amount of money that suddenly allows him to do things. So as you'll see later, among other things, like during the period where he's attempting to do his own inner work, he like hand builds a small castle on the shores of a lake. Right? So if you want to do the kind of like inner work and individuation where you get to build a castle, the recommendation is, I guess, marry into money. I don't know if that's a general psychological principle, but I think it didn't hurt. So he goes and he visits Freud, and there is no question in 1907 when they meet that what happens you could pretty easily describe as a classic bromance. So they totally hit it off. In fact, by all accounts, that basically being theirs and their wives, that first meeting, they basically meet and then they talk nonstop for 13 hours, I think. Yeah, 13 hours. They just talk nonstop, like into the night. He arrives and they kind of go off. And there is this real sense of kindred feeling between them, that they're sort of engaged in a common endeavor. Now, because of the nature that Freud already had a certain amount of status and publication, right, that he was something of an underground theorist that people were paying attention to, but he was a big deal. In a sense, Jung becomes the apprentice to Freud's master. And very rapidly, he's recognized both by Freud, okay, and by the psychodynamic and sort of psychotherapeutic community at large as sort of the crown prince. The idea is that he is sort of being groomed to carry the movement forward after Freud. Now, they have this really high energy exchange. It's quite productive, right? They take a trip together to America, which ends up actually causing some problems between them. We'll touch on that later. But the point is they have this really high energy situation. And all of that lasts until 1913. And in 1913, the bromance ends. That's when they have their breakup. This is in part because Jung had been tussling with some issues. One, he had certain problems with the Freudian theory. His first problem with the Freudian theory was that the Freudian theory, which we'll get into in some detail in the next lecture, this week, but next lecture, the Freudian theory relies on this concept of libido, right? Sexual energy. And the idea is that, essentially speaking, within the Freudian system, it's sort of all about sex, the sexual energy, and distortions of that sexual energy, right, are more or less what powers and motivates the psyche. At the end of the day, it's all about sex. Freud later amends this, a la Sabina Spielrein, and introduces the thanatoic, the death drive. But at the start, the erotic, eros, the libido, this is like the core of the Freudian idea, right? And if you know a little bit about Freud, I mean, everybody knows the jokes about Freud, right? Tell me about your mother, right? Okay, where does that idea come from? In some ways, that's not totally inaccurate. Freud saw most of the blockages that people were having as being these psychosexual stages that they were going through as the sexual energy tried to liberate. And Freud had, at the time, right, the idea that unconscious contents, essentially speaking, were things that were repressed, right? So what happened was that contents of your mind that were just culturally unacceptable would get pushed down into the unconscious as a kind of like dank basement, right? And you would push them down there, you would repress them. And when they would come back up in dreams, they would have to come up as symbols, right? Basically so that they could sort of make it past the border guards of your ego. So we'll talk more about the Freudian system as we go, but the idea is that, right, these repressed contents of the libido are trying to like work their way up, and they have to do it in code, but it's all about libido. Now, in a way, okay, and again, I should underline, you know, Freud is the butt of a lot of jokes, and I think that's kind of unfair, okay? Freud, without question, is a giant. I mean, he was an intellectual titan. Not that his ideas were wholly original. His ideas, actually, many of them turn up before that, right? He draws pretty heavily, among other things, on Plato. However, there's no question that he gets to, as John Vervaeke sometimes says, he gets to be in the Hall of the Immortals. I've always liked that phrase. He gets to be in the Hall of the Immortals. And the reason is, if nothing else, for popularizing this notion of the unconscious, right? Prior to that, it's not, again, that he invented the unconscious, but it didn't really have the same kind of foothold in discourse around the workings of the mind, right? The operating assumption was that we are rational, conscious beings, right? And insofar as we're rational, conscious beings, we were sort of like one-pointed philosophical beings. You know, your mind was your mind, and you had access to it, etc. The idea that there were processes and contents in your mind that you didn't have access to, right? But that did have symbolically, right, and sort of, you know, outside your awareness, these effects on your behaviors, and possibly even manifesting as physical symptoms, psychosomatic symptoms, was a shocking revelation, right, for late 19th century and early 20th century thinkers, right? So Freud gets to be in the Hall of the Immortals for that. But Jung starts to break with it for a few reasons. So one more thing. That idea that everything boils down to sex, right? In a way, you can actually see that idea carried into sort of the ideas of like modern evolutionary psychology and stuff, right? Anytime people go back to sort of a genetic explanation, right? And you can consider things like the selfish gene, right? Dawkins, which is pretty dated, but you know, it gets some of these ideas across. The idea is that, like, no matter what the manifestation is, it's all being driven by reproduction. That is the powerhouse. In a sense, right, the psychological manifestation of that would be something like Freud's libido, right? The libido is powering everything. You might think you're doing other things, art, you know, altruism, whatever, spirituality, but in fact, it's all about libido. It's all about this driving sex energy that's like powering you, right? And that sort of those needs of sex and reproduction trump everything else, and they just take various kinds of manifestations. But Jung starts to take issue with that idea, and the reason is that basically he begins to think that maybe it's not all just about sex, or at least not in a simple sense, right? He retains the idea of libido, but he begins to suspect that maybe there are other kinds of organizing centers within the structure of the mind, right? So in the simple Freudian model, right, we have sort of ego in the middle, right, which is the everyday conscious self. That's what you identify with, right? And below that, we have the id. And the id is like appetites, right? So it's all these unrestrained, uncivilized animal appetites and desires, right? So it's sex and it's food and it's satiation and it's violence, right? And so you have the ego pushing up hydraulically, right, the id pushing up hydraulically on the ego, and then you have the superego, which is the sort of internalized parent, the social code. It's the finger wagger, right? It's the right? You've got that pushing down. And the ego within the Freudian system is essentially speaking trapped between these things, right? Base impulses, like just do it, it'll feel good, right? Along with you really ought not to, which is pushing down, right? You can see that that's, in some ways, right, it's like having an angel and a devil on your shoulder, right? It's not quite as simple as good and evil, right? So it doesn't boil down in quite that sense, but it's a similar kind of idea. You've got the ego and you've got the superego pushing on it, and right, do pro-social things, be well behaved, right? No. And then you've got the id going, do it, right? And so those two things, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's a kind of hydraulic model of the psyche. Jung, on the other hand, starts to think that maybe there are other organizing centers and indeed other energies. And the breakup in 1913 finally comes about because Jung, after long consideration, decides to publish this piece where he basically talks about the heroic energy, right? About the heroic drive. And the idea that the heroic drive isn't just sort of a sex drive, that there is this other organizing center. And that there were already some issues and misgivings between them, but basically drops that, and it's tantamount to heresy, right, within the Freudian set. He's contradicting, Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud wasn't having it. He really wanted people to obey, and so they have this breakup. The breakup is nasty. When you look at the letters that are exchanged between them, I have always felt in reading them that Jung is civil, if a little bit maybe slightly catty, or a little passive aggressive maybe by times. But Freud is nasty. Freud is straight up nasty. He's insulting. And Freud started to sort of badmouth Jung everywhere. He basically attempted to push him out, right? And indeed to shut down his practice. He tried to keep people from seeing Jung, from working with Jung. And as Jung began to accumulate his own sort of group of people who were interested in his theoretical ideas and interested in training with him and so on and so forth, the Freudians did not like this, and they did their utmost to shut that down. Now, I have to admit that, from a 21st century perspective, there's something that's always struck me as vaguely weird about that particular split. And it reminds me of this, okay? I used to live in England. I lived in Cambridge for a while. And when I was there, right, every now and then we would get people from elsewhere, from the States or from Canada or whatever. And we would meet people, grad students who were there. And I had a friend at Cambridge who was Irish. She was Irish. And periodically people would meet her and they would think she was English, right? People who don't have an especially strong ear for accents they'd hear it and they'd be like, oh, you're English. And she would fume, right? This made her so mad. Now, if you know anything about the historical sort of conflict between England and Ireland, that stuff becomes more obvious, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that that there were still sort of ongoing militant terrorist actions and military actions, right, occurring between those two groups, right? The IRA and bombings, like that was recent. But the point is, right, making that particular confusion, right, is similarly, of course, when I was there, I dated a young woman, an English woman at the time. And at one point, I said to her, oh, I love your accent. She was English and she had a very received pronunciation accent. I was like, I love your accent. And she says to me, oh, I love your accent too. And I say, stupidly, I don't have an accent. And she says, well, yes, you do. Of course you do. You have an American accent. And I, of course, immediately was like, I certainly do not, right? Like, minimally, I have a Canadian accent, and then proceeded to like really stress the aboots. I'll tell you a funny story about that, but not now. It would be a digression now. I'm going to try to control that. But there's a reason why Americans think Canadians say aboot, and Canadians often don't know what they're talking about. There's an actual reason for that. Anyway, we'll come back to it. So I was like, I certainly do not have an American accent. You know, I have a Canadian accent. At best, I would accept, or at worst, I would accept that I speak in, you know, a standard newscaster or something of the like, right? Now, if you think about that, like what's happening there? What's happening there is that, you know, Canadian to American, it's a pretty small difference. Geographically, we're very similar. We have relatively similar cultural histories. Like we have far more in common than we have different. From an international perspective, the same might be said of Ireland and England. Like they have a lot of commonalities, right? In their language and their inflection, in their cultural backgrounds. But it's the differences because they're similar that are emphasized between the two groups, right? And they want to differentiate each other, right? From each other quite powerfully. And you can see the same thing occur all over the place, right? You get any two groups that get sort of mistaken for each other, and they'll get very, you know, hot under the collar. Well, this, it seems to me, is often what the situation is like between Jungians and Freudians, which is to say that actually the two groups have much more in common as psychodynamic theorists than they have different, but they have this long history, right? The Freudians have often seen the Jungians historically as being sort of, you know, flaky, you know, mystic, cultish weirdos, right? And the Jungians have felt sort of persecuted, and also they think that, you know, the Freudians are, you know, sort of ignoring, you know, important aspects of experience and so on and so forth. So there has been this historical conflict between two of them that makes them differentiate, but really they have a lot more in common than they have different. A number of years ago, 10 years ago, I was actually sitting with Tony Toniato, who some of you would know was until recently the director of the Buddhist Psychology and Mental Health program. And I had gone into his office hours when, you know, at one point to sit with him because I was really interested in asking him the question, and the question that had been boiling on my mind, right? So Tony had has a background in clinical psychology, okay, in Buddhism. So he's a Vajrayana, he's Tibetan Buddhist by training. His original background, he's Italian and Greek. So I don't know whether he leans on the Orthodox or the Catholic side of Christianity, but right. But then also he's a Freudian. And when I say he's a Freudian, I mean, like, you know, at the time he was engaged in training as a Freudian analyst, right? So not just a theorist, like he was doing a classical Freudian training. He was on the couch, right? 4 days a week, right? And like classic training, okay? So in the attempt to square these things off, right, I was really struck by the fact that he was a Freudian. And so I went into his office hours and I said, like, Tony, why Freud? Why Freud, right? This really like stuck with me, like, why Freud, okay? Now, Tony, I didn't know him as well then, and he very ably deflected me because he just, you know, was like, well, why Jung, right? He asks me, and of course I didn't anticipate that question for some reason. And so I was sort of thrown back and I was like, why Jung, right? And the answer that I gave, I think really actually speaks to the specific interest, and one of the reasons I think this material is still quite relevant, which is what I said was, of all of the sort of modern, early modern psychodynamic theorists, Jung is the one who takes most seriously the realities of the soul. Now, what do I mean by that? And you may have caught that with the Murray-Stein BTS thing, right? Map of the soul. Well, what are we talking about when we're talking about the soul? So to be clear, this is not primarily a religious idea. I'm not talking here about primarily a metaphysical claim, right? I'm not talking about, you know, in some sense, right, the classical idea of the soul, like an animating ghost that lives in your body that is going to survive after death. we'll talk about some of that stuff. But the point is that that isn't really what I mean by takes seriously the realities of the soul. What I mean is that Jung takes very seriously the spiritual dimensions of human experience. Now, to talk about spiritual dimensions immediately invites sometimes for some people, many people, a certain perception of flakiness, right? Yet spiritual obviously is one of these demographic descriptors that people use more and more. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, people will say. Okay, and that can mean a grab bag of different things, right? It's highly individualized. But when we're talking about the spiritual and the soul in this context, what we mean is that, regardless of what you think about the metaphysical situation, right, that constitutes human experience and the nature of the world and the nature of our being in it, it's unquestionable that human beings experience things in those terms very often, right? So things like mystical experiences, as we've already discussed a little bit, and we'll discuss a great deal more, mystical experiences have this profound shaping character on people who experience them, right? These are the kinds of things that can change the course of somebody's life, and not just one person's life, right? Many of the great religions of the world were, essentially speaking, based on an individual or a small number of individuals' mystical experiences, which were then codified and brought through the population. Like, there's something very specific about these kinds of encounters with the spiritual and with something that seems to be sort of more than the mundane aspects of the world, right? That has a powerful shaping influence. And again, right, we can leave aside, we can remain agnostic about the metaphysics, about whether or not these things are the case. And indeed, I'm gonna ask you to try to take that stance. That is very much the stance I will take in this course. It's a stance that I try to adopt generally, right? Radical agnosticism. Like, I describe myself as a militant agnostic, right? So the idea is that, there are limits to epistemology, limits to what we can know. One of those limits, in my opinion, is it's very hard to get like a final sense of what's going on in reality, okay? Like, ultimately what the explanation is. But the experience is incontestable. People definitely have these experiences, and they're powerful, right? These are powerful experiences that people have. So when I say that Jung takes seriously the realities of the soul, what I mean by that is Jung takes very seriously the phenomenological experience of human being as more than just the simple set of issues in the world, right? As being a much broader sense of relationship to self and relationship to the universe and questions of meaning, right? And that those things have a transcendent dimension to them in terms of our experiences that you can't ignore, okay? So to give you an idea of that very briefly, right? A famous idea that again is kind of a lasting influence of Jung. For those of you that are familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, okay, Alcoholics Anonymous has been a really big influential movement in the treatment of alcoholism, right, through the 20th century. And there's a bunch of things going on in Alcoholics Anonymous. We'll talk about that stuff later. But, one of the things is that Alcoholics Anonymous, basically operates on this idea that you require a kind of connection to some sort of higher power, something bigger than yourself, in order to affect the kind of change necessary to overcome alcoholism, right? And a lot of the time that gets conventionally framed as God or Jesus or whatever, but not necessarily so. And indeed, that idea, right, Bill W., the guy who famously wrote the AA kind of method, right, came up with this stuff, was in correspondence with Jung. And Jung essentially wrote, right, that what is required is some kind of contact with this higher power, what Jung would call the self, capital S, okay, as distinguished from small s, self, which is just like me, right? Capital S, self. That making contact with this spiritual dimension, right, of experience was what was required to sort of catalyze change, okay? And that's been a hugely, hugely influential idea. And as we'll see, has a significant and mounting amount of science behind it as well. Now, you'll also see that within the specific framework, we don't have to lean in on any particular formulation, any particular religious formulation. And Jung didn't. He was not an orthodox anything. And arguably, he's not even a conventional Christian, which is something that we'll talk about at length. He has certainly unusual ideas. But the point is, those spiritual dimensions of experience and the sort of various influences and aspects of the psyche that fall under that kind of heading are a huge deal, right, within Jung. And that's really at the root of his breakup with Freud. So the bromance ends in 1913. And it's at this point that Jung begins to basically go through what he calls later the confrontation with the unconscious, sometimes called the night journey. Confrontation with the unconscious. If you want a sort of, if you were going to take a highly skeptical view of his work, you would basically say that he underwent a psychotic break, which is to say that he began to experience visions and voices, like he fractured to a significant extent. Now, interestingly, he managed to maintain a day life in this period, like he saw clients and went about his business. But then when he was by himself, he describes a period of tremendous psychological agitation, right? He saw visions, his dreams were very active. And as you'll see in the next sort of video lecture, very briefly, he began, of course, work on what became a pivotal early work of his, right? Liber Novus, the Red Book. And you'll see this thing, it's an immense, it's just it's a burglar smiting tome. But he basically starts working on this thing, and it's a way of trying to get this material that he's experiencing in the confrontation with the unconscious on the page to start to structure it. He descends into this thing, and basically he thinks he's losing his mind, and maybe he is. This is the important thing. Even if you want to view it as it's a descent into psychosis for him, the point is that he decides, he makes this decision to drop into it and engage it, not to fight it, not to ignore it, right? But rather to move into a place where this enormous upwelling of visionary material, right? Archetypal material, sort of mythic material, and so on and so forth, all of these voices and images and stuff that were coming at him, he decides to engage with that. And as he does, he finds that it begins to enter into dialogue with him. It's as though he's communicating. One part of himself is communicating with other aspects of himself. And in so doing, he starts to get a sense of sort of the structure of his own psyche. And then, rung by rung, he climbs his way out. He puts himself back together. That descent, that there were, of course, earlier influences, right, in Freud's work and in Jung's early work and so on and so forth. But it's generally considered that this confrontation with the unconscious, okay, marks the period where Jung in midlife goes through this shattering breakup, right? He loses the kind of surrogate father figure in Freud. And then in the effort to put himself back together, he really finds what ends up being his method, right? He finds sort of the essence of Jungian psychology. And in some ways, he spends the rest of his career, he spends nearly 50 years after that, okay, just elaborating and attempting to deepen his understanding of the insights that he has during this experience, right? Where he descends into that material, where it washes over him. Now, if any of you have ever had an experience of this kind, and I have in several sort of different domains, but if you've ever had an experience of this kind, you'll understand that this kind of material is overwhelming, right? It's so powerful, and it can be elating, it can be inflating, it can be terrifying, right? You can really feel like you are losing it, right? Like you're sort of falling apart. There's some dangers there. And I certainly don't want to give anybody any ideas. Like, this sort of work in some ways is maybe not for everybody, and it's not for the faint of heart in some sense. I don't believe that any one path is ideal for everybody. That's just my personal take, right? In some ways, I am still a perennialist, and I think that there's 1,000 paths up the mountain, as there were. So it certainly isn't for everybody, and it can be a powerful experience. And for people who, are already sort of having difficulty with, their mental health, their sense of reality, their sense of integration, and so on and so forth, this can be really a difficult experience, a dangerous experience, potentially speaking. However, if you do manage to do some of this work, and if you start to sort of go through the process of what Jung eventually came to call individuation, right, which is a never-ending process. It's not terminal. It's not like, and now I've individuated. That's not how it works, and we'll get into that. But if you start to go through this process of working with your your inner landscape, these inner figures. It's immensely rewarding, for one thing. It injects a kind of meaning and structure into experience, and it introduces a change to the way that your own psychology and consciousness approach the world and your own experience. That's sort of, it's frankly difficult to describe. And, you know, it's sufficiently difficult to describe that we're going to spend a whole year on it, and we'll really just be scratching the surface. If you are really into this stuff, you will find that, you know, well, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of books, and I've been doing this kind of work for many years, and I was in analysis for many years. And in some ways, right, it's an ongoing process. But that sort of gives you some loose overview of sort of where Jung was coming from in terms of the man and his times. And from there, you'll see sort of the progression of his life and the development of his ideas, you know, kind of continue. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to start to talk about some of those ideas. What are the theoretics, right? The structure of the psyche in some sense, and some of these core terms in Jungian psychology. And that is for this next lecture upcoming.